Welcome to part one of our summer webinar series, delving into topics and issues found in the Foundation for Child Development's recent publication, Getting It Right, using implementation research to improve outcomes in early care and education. We are proud to present this work as it provides insights into the value of including implementation research in the study of early care and education and the potential of such research to improve programs and policies and to achieve stronger outcomes for all young children. Today, we will examine what more we need to know and do in implementing high-quality early care and education. My name is Dr. Sarah Vecchiotti, Vice President of Research and Program Innovation. I am delighted to have the honor of introducing our esteemed presenters, many of whom are also contributing authors to the publication. First, you will hear from our own Dr. Jacqueline Jones, President and CEO of the Foundation for Child Development, who will explain why the Foundation saw this as important work to pursue. Next, Dr. Linda Espinoza, Professor Emeritus at the University of Missouri-Columbia, will share insights from her individual chapter, followed by Dr. Dale Farron, Professor Emeritus at Peabody College at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Robert Pianta, Dean of the Curry School of Education and Human Development at the University of Virginia, will discuss key takeaways from his chapter, followed by Dr. Jason Sachs, Director of Early Childhood at the Boston Public Schools. Last but not least, Dr. Ellen Freedy, Senior Co-Director at the National Institute for Early Education Research at Rutgers University, serves as discussant, sharing her own thoughts and reflections. Before I turn the webinar over to Jacqueline, we will briefly touch on logistics. At the end of the webinar, we will have a Q&A session. To submit a question for the presenters, please submit your question using the question box. While you may submit a question at any time throughout the webinar, questions will not be addressed until the end of the call during the official Q&A session. Please follow the Foundation on Twitter at FCDUSORG and use the hashtag #GettingItRight to share your thoughts. Thank you in advance for submitting questions. We would also like to thank Cherise Brammer, Communications Officer, and Andrea Kent, Program Officer at the Foundation, who both helped plan this event today and are providing technical support. Now, Jacqueline, please take it away.
Thank you, Sarah. On behalf of the Board of Directors and the staff of the Foundation for Child Development, I'm delighted to welcome our panelists and virtual guests to part one of our summer webinar series. In this three-part series, we will examine some of the topics and issues that are raised in the Foundation's recent publication, Getting It Right, Using Implementation Research to Improve Outcomes in Early Care and Education. For over 100 years, the Foundation has supported research on the well-being of young children. Our work is centered on filling gaps in research knowledge and making research more relevant and useful to policymakers and practitioners. Our new publication began as a set of questions about what really is working in interventions for young children. We know that well-executed randomized controlled trials can give us evidence of the impact of early education on the performance of young children. Yet RCTs alone do not always lead us to a clear understanding of exactly why some children's performance may go up or down. The new work proposes that we augment RCT findings with rigorous empirical data that can provide important information about the context in which the intervention is conducted. We especially hope to engage applied researchers who wish to use their methodological skills to help policymakers and practitioners figure out the right questions that need to be answered if we are to enhance the quality of life for all young children. In this publication, we have attempted to lift up a variety of questions that we think are important to move forward and bring more early care and education programs to scale at the federal, state, and local levels. When public funds are allocated to interventions for young children, we have a dual set of obligations. First, to make sure that every child has access to the supports they need to grow, develop, learn, and become productive members of society. And two, that public funds are invested wisely. We hope this publication can spark a conversation that will enhance both equity and accountability. We also hope to initiate a conversation that's centered on what else needs to be explored about how programs are operationalized and what shape new research might take. And we believe that multiple perspectives will serve to enrich the discussion. 2 weeks ago, on June 30th, at the publication's launch, we explored questions such as, what does research tell us about early childhood intervention programs? What are reasonable expectations for program effectiveness? How do we use a social determinants of early learning framework to eliminate early educational disparities and opportunity gaps? If you missed the webinar for the launch or want to see it again, it's on our website. Today, we will explore what more we need to know and do as we work to bring high-quality early education to scale. Our guests will discuss strategies for addressing equal access and high quality for dual language learners, making preschool classrooms more responsive to children's development, improving quality and impact through workforce development, and bringing high-quality programs to scale. I am beyond grateful to all of our authors who have given their considerable time and expertise to this project. Many of them have conducted groundbreaking research that now serves as the foundation for our knowledge of what it takes to offer high-quality experiences to young children. And as global attention has focused on issues of racial and social justice, we see from this foundational research that issues of equity, of access to food, healthcare, housing, and high-quality early experiences have hovered over the early childhood landscape for a very long time. This work is an opportunity to build on our research foundations, to explore root causes, to examine our research methodology, and build stronger connections across research, policy, and practice. So again, welcome, and let's begin our look at what more we need to know with Dr. Linda Espinosa. Linda, please get us started.
Okay. Thank you, Jacqueline, and I'm delighted to participate in this effort by the Foundation for Child Development. So what I'm going to talk about this morning is addressing the equity in the early childhood classroom, or equal access and high quality for dual language learners. Go to the next slide, please. What I'm going to do is present some of the highlights from the chapter. There's much more detail and suggestions for further follow-up and research recommendations in the chapter, but I'm just going to quickly highlight what are some of the main points from the chapter. So one of the first things that I think we need to pay attention to is the demographic urgency for high quality for dual language learners. And dual language learners are children who speak primarily a language other than English in the home. We know that there are rising numbers of children who do not speak English in the home across the country and across all of our different early childhood settings. We have about 30% nationally across all program types who do not speak English in the home, but that varies enormously community by community and state by state. So for instance, in California, about 60% of children ages birth to 5 do not speak English in the home, and about 80 to 85% of all classrooms provide services to children and families whose first language is not English. So we know that the numbers are rising, as well as the numbers of different types of languages that are presented in our families. So not only do we have greater numbers of dual language learners, we also have greater numbers of different languages to address. And the second part of that urgency has to do with the confusion around best practices for dual language learners, which has led to chronic school underachievement and thwarted potential. So until very recently, and I would say probably within the last couple of years, we've really had very little specific guidance that could provide teachers with some sort of framework, some sort of blueprint about how to address the needs of children whose languages are not spoken by the staff and the teachers in the classroom. This is particularly urgent when you have communities of multiple languages and primarily monolingual English-speaking early childhood educators. And I would have to say that that is the most common condition that we have across the country. So let's go to the next slide. Luckily, we actually are in a very fortunate position here at this point in time. And after 40 years of working in this field, I feel like we have made such significant progress, both in understanding how first and second languages develop, how they interact with each other, what are the significant factors that contribute to first and second language acquisition, and how can we design our early educational environments to best support their long-term school and achievement and life success. So we do have this recent report, and we can provide you with the link to that, around recent science and dual language learners from the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. And this was about a 2.5 to 3 year study group that reviewed all of the research on bilingual development from birth to 21. We had a committee of very diverse professional backgrounds and expertise, including a neuroscientist, a demographer, a sociologist, several developmental psychologists, educators, program evaluators, et cetera. And through long and intense deliberations, we did provide a summary of what we know, birth to 5 and then kindergarten through 12th grade. What do we know about their development, and what do we know about school practices and policies that will promote their high levels of achievement long term? The interesting thing about this committee, and of course I was in the birth to 5 group, but when we read all of the chapters and all of the sections summarizing all of the research, a very interesting and compelling finding was that we were consistent birth through 21. So our findings converge, which again helps researchers and policymakers have a lot of confidence that what we are coming to in terms of conclusions and recommendations are in fact representing the best science and will contribute to best practices as well. So what have we found? Next slide, please. So what are the findings for children from birth to 5 that we have a great deal of confidence or have firm conclusions in? And the first one, and this is something that all of our studies pointed to, which was that the capacity for all infants to attain high levels of bilingualism. Some of the neuroscience research that's been conducted in the last 10 to 15 years has really shown us how extremely talented and gifted the human baby is in its ability to learn languages, multiple languages. And this capacity actually starts in the last trimester of pregnancy when the auditory canals are fully developed. Babies start to hear and differentiate languages based on their phonology and their rhythm so that they can start to say, well, this is the category of Spanish or English or some other language. They very quickly can categorize and discriminate and learn the main features of each of those languages. And by about 5 or 6 months of age, they actually show behaviorally that they know the differences between, say, Spanish and English, or Spanish and French, or German and English, et cetera. They really capture that. So they have these brains that are neurologically prepared and attentive to, focused on the process of language learning, which makes them ideal time to acquire multiple languages. The second point on there about balance skills are important. So the other thing that we've learned that is important for educators is that it's not just proficiency in the home language or just proficiency in English, but in fact, when children enter into kindergarten and as they progress through the grades, a balanced capacity in both languages so that they have strong home language skills that support their acquisition of the second language, and both of those capacities are promoted throughout their schooling experience. Early exposure leads to best outcomes. This was a little surprising, but actually if children are exposed to a second language before age 3, and I think it has something to do with that, brain capacity during those early months and years, that earlier exposure leads to the best outcomes in the second language. But there's a conundrum here that I'll explain in a minute as well. And like all children, dual language learners require frequent, enriched language interactions that are responsive, varied, and expanded from competent speakers. And when I say responsive, what I mean is that so when the child expresses an interest in something, let's say it's a leaf or it's a block, that the educator is contingently responsive or responds to what the child is indicating an interest in and builds on try to redirect a child's attention to something else. They're not as likely to learn that concept, to learn that language that you are using in the interaction. So we want to be responsive, varied, so we use lots of adjectives and adverbs, and we build upon what the child says, even though the child may not be understanding what we're saying. And competent speakers. So the adults who are speaking with children need to be good language role models, which has real implications in hiring and professional development. They represent accurate, both grammatical and vocabulary, et cetera. So children learn the features of the language that will prepare them then to go on and learn more sophisticated academic language. Home language must be intentionally and explicitly supported. Again, this is a finding across the board that we have to pay special attention, or that home language will start to decrease, and its ability to support second language acquisition will be reduced. And we all found that families are critical to early bilingualism, particularly in maintaining the home language. Families are critical and necessary partners across all early childhood, but around language development for dual language learners, they are absolutely essential to achieving our bilingual goals. And then finally, the specific instructional approaches, both in early childhood, birth to 5, and K-12, so that all teachers can learn specific scaffolding techniques that help children understand the language of the classroom, even if it's not the language of the home. There are multiple strategies, and I've listed some in my chapter, but we have emerging research base about how to promote both home language and explicit instruction in English, even when teachers are monolingual. So I would say that's the hopeful and encouraging aspect of where we are in research and practice at this point in time. Doesn't mean we always do it, but I think we're getting to the point where we know what to do with much more precision. Can we go to the next slide? So the basic principle of best practices for early childhood education for DLLs, and it's not overwhelming until you start thinking about how to implement this. So we need early proficiency in both the home language, because that's essential to acquiring a second language, and English at kindergarten entry is important to becoming academically proficient in the second language. So we have, several really good studies that show us that when they have strong skills in both their home language and English, some level of English proficiency, that they tend to do better in English reading and across the academic subject areas by 3rd and 4th grade, and are less likely to drop out of school. An interesting finding as well is that when children become fully bilingual at kindergarten entry, or they have strong skills in both languages, that they tend to have the highest reading scores in 3rd and 4th grade, and their academic achievement exceeds that of monolingual English speakers, even when the monolingual speakers are assessed in English. So it's amazing how this bilingual exposure does promote certain cognitive and academic advantages for children. So the main point, systematic exposure to English and ongoing support of home language, a language-rich environment is critical. Next slide, please. So I did want to emphasize this aspect of home language loss, because even though we understand it intellectually that it's important to support home language, oftentimes it's difficult to implement practices that achieve that goal with children who don't speak the same language that we do. But we found out through multiple research studies how important the home language is for personal, sociocultural, educational, and economic reasons. That children are socialized through a particular cultural identity, and language is huge in maintaining that identity and maintaining a good family connections and relationships. And unfortunately, historically, in the United States, dual language learners, once they enter into an early childhood program, have tended to lose that home language capacity. And that's across multiple studies and unfortunately, our programs have not historically tended to both languages as much as they have focused on, in some cases, rapid acquisition of English. So the more loss, the earlier exposure to English. And again, this is something that I think we need to be aware of, that even though all children can achieve early bilingualism and second language exposure is beneficial to infants and toddlers and preschoolers, it's not always practiced in a way that promotes those important goals around home language maintenance. So we have to really prepare ourselves in multiple ways to support that, even when we don't speak those languages. And again, like I said before, parents play a huge role in maintaining that home language proficiency in everything they do in the home and the way they communicate the value of that language, as well as teachers communicating and respecting and honoring that home language and how central it is to that child's overall development, short-term and long-term. Okay, next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but there are multiple.
Linda, this is Jacqueline. You have 1 minute. I just want to give you a 1 minute warning.
Thank you for reminding me. I do tend to, go on. But okay. So what are the language approaches for dual language learning? Obviously, if you have the capacity and the language structure in a community or classroom, dual language approaches are recommended and ideal for children to achieve the language and academic mastery they will need long term. The most common model that we have across programs would be defined as a primarily English with support for home language. So in these models, what we found is that global high quality, and I think Dale and several others are going to talk about this later, what that is. That's an essential foundation. Global high quality is important for all children, including DLLs, but it's not enough. So for when you have children who are dual language learners, educators need to learn a set of strategies that will support that home language while they are also intentionally providing that exposure to English. And English immersion, not recommended ever for dual language learners.
So Linda, we probably need to stop and we can ask more questions during the Q&A. And I think for Dale to come on next would be a good thing. So thank you so much. Was that your end? Thank you. Thank you, Linda. Our next presenter is Dr. Dale Farron from Vanderbilt University. Dale?
Welcome to everybody in the webinar, and real thanks to you, Jacqueline, for pulling this all together. It's been a wonderful adventure for the last several years that we've been on this trek together. So I think the publication is terrific, and I highly recommend it to people. The chapters are relatively short and to the point, and I think very useful. Next slide. So part of this adventure we've been on is this search for early childhood education quality, which many people are engaged in. And sadly, we really don't have very many predictors that we've used across studies and that we can say uniformly, this is what quality is. We continue to use measures that are more about structural characteristics that tend to account for very little variation in outcome. And which means then that as states ramp up their statewide support for pre-K programs, they have little guidance for setting up high quality. It's really difficult. They tend to use more structural factors in terms of numbers of kids in the classroom, the teacher-child ratio, and so forth. But there is work that's being done. There's new work, some of which done by me, using behavioral indicators rather than ratings. These behavioral counts have an advantage in that they tend to be better defined, narrower, and they provide coaches more information about behaviors that could be changed. But the question is, if you use behavioral counts, which behaviors are you counting? Which behaviors in classrooms really might matter? We've done a lot of research on this, including into kindergarten, and across our studies and others, there are 4 areas that have been identified as important. I think when you see these, you're going to say that, well, this is not rocket science, except it must be, because we don't see this happening very much in the pre-kindergarten classrooms we observe and visit. Next slide. So the first has to do with the quality of instruction that's provided. As you know, a lot of these pre-kindergarten programs really focus on kindergarten readiness, and they tend to use more known answered questions. So what color is this? What letter is this? What number is this? These are right and wrong types that are focused on concrete learning and not discovery. And what we've determined from a lot of studies now is that this sort of didactic instruction can fool you, because it can lead to immediate gains in children when they're entering kindergarten, but those gains tend to be fragile. They fade almost immediately in kindergarten, and children learn very quickly. They're just 26 letters in the alphabet, and other children who haven't been to pre-K learn those letters very soon in kindergarten. Open-ended or inferential questions happen way too seldom in pre-kindergarten classrooms. Inferential learning requires a different kind of instructional approach than whole group. And whole group is the most common type of instruction observed in pre-K classrooms. It's very difficult to engage with children and get them thinking when they're involved in a whole group setting, especially when they're young. Next slide. So this is I couldn't have made this up. This was in a classroom I observed. It was on a board to show the principal and the parents in this pre-K classroom what was happening week to week. So it has the letters that are being covered in that week, the unit, the sight words that the teacher is covering, and the nursery rhyme. So this is a little overwhelming when you look at how much is going to be covered sort of every week, and this is only halfway through the year. Anyway, this is not the kind of discovery learning I'm talking about. Next slide. So the second thing is, the second aspect is to create a more positive tone in the classroom, more smiling, more behavior approving, less behavior disapproving. The trouble, one of the problems with having our pre-kindergarten classrooms in public schools, especially when they don't have bathrooms in the classroom and they have their meals in the big cafeteria, is that it requires a lot of behavior management and disapproving, actually, to get children to line up, move quietly through the hall, and interact appropriately in settings that have many older children in them. So what we see is about twice the rate of behavior disapproving as behavior approving. And this is important. Next slide. Our data show that those somewhat simple things, approving and disapproving, are actually linked to children's developmental gains. Less behavior disapproving is linked to gains in achievement. This is across studies. More behavior approving is linked to gains in self-regulation, which makes a lot of sense. If you say to a child, I really like what you're doing, keep doing it, it suggests the child has some internal control and actually can control his or her own behavior. Fewer behavior reminders were linked to gains in self-regulation. Next slide. The reason this is important is Barbara Fredrickson's has a wonderful set of notions about what she calls broaden and build, that positive, and which makes a lot of sense for the kinds of pre-kindergarten classrooms we want to set up. Positive emotions are linked to a wider range of thoughts and actions, to making connections among ideas. Positive emotions loosen the hold that a negative emotion might have on an individual's mindset. And we were talking about pre-K classrooms that serve children from high poverty areas. They need more positive affirmation. Positive emotions can protect you protect the child from the cardiovascular sequelae of negative emotions, which we have shown, data have shown, research has shown, last well into adulthood. It relates to something called biobehavioral synchrony. That is, shared positive emotional connections create mirroring across other people's behaviors, their bodies, and their brains, as does the opposite. So creating a positive, affirming environment is really critical for young children. Next slide. So 3, child environments should be places where interesting things happen and children are engaged. Next slide. This means teachers need to be engaged with children in the process of discovering, not just didactic instruction, but actually discovering with children. Next slide. And the room should be set up so there are interesting activities for children to capture their attention. 10 years ago, I would not have had to say this, but in the classrooms that I'm visiting that are in elementary schools, that are pre-K, center-based time is often treated as just a time for the teacher, for no learning to take place or very little. It's not treated nearly as seriously as it used to be. I don't see teachers setting up new activities, introducing children to new things they can discover the way we used to see in early childhood classrooms 10, 15 years ago. But we need to start doing that again. We need to take center time seriously and create activities and change those activities so that children get engaged and learn to persist as they play. Next slide. Finally, teachers need to listen more to children. So you'll see a lot of discussion about teacher talk. I'm not interested in teacher talk. I'm interested in teacher listening. Next slide. These are data that we took across a morning before nap time and in preschool classrooms and pre-K classrooms, and teachers were talking 71% of the time. They were listening to children 9% of the time. So if you think about this kind of classroom, children are awash in teacher talk. But it's very hard for teachers to differentiate instructions if they don't listen to children. You can't know what children know or don't know, or what sense they're making of the world if you don't listen to them. Learning doesn't take place only because you're talking. It takes place because you're responsive to what it is children know. Next slide. So my final thoughts is there, under this pressure for kindergarten readiness, we've had increased pressure on the development of concrete skills, and that pressure may interfere with teachers behaving in the 4 ways I've described. We need to have our focus on longer-term school success, not immediate kindergarten readiness, and the factors may be quite different for long-term success. We need to bring teachers in as partners in the development of these quality indicators. Young children are vulnerable, especially those from high-risk backgrounds. So this is really very important. Quality matters. I fear that settings like public school pre-K classrooms may limit what we can examine. And in the future, we need to systematically examine quality indicators across different settings with more varied populations of children. But we need to get this right. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dale. That's great. And our next presenter is Dr. Bob Pianta from the University of Virginia.
Thanks, Jacqueline. It's a great pleasure to be part of this, and as it's evolved over time, and I appreciate the way that you've created a very rich environment for the authors to interact with one another and with folks in the field. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what we've been learning around quality improvement and impact in broader systems of implementation around workforce development. So this is work that we've been doing for a number of years in a number of states and localities across the country. And I think I would offer it as kind of a set of lessons learned and observations from that work. Next slide, please. So if we look at kind of the current state of workforce development, and I think this has been summarized by many folks over the course of the last several years, there's a number of different components of this that really that are pretty consistent across, whether it's a state, a national system like Head Start, or even local systems. Generally speaking, the current state is fairly, if we talk about what ought to be, or we would hope to be, a kind of an organized system that takes a lot of moving parts and moves them toward a particular goal of workforce development. The current state is really quite different than that. Things are quite fragmented and misaligned. So we have things like higher education, credentialing and certifying teachers around a set of skills that may not be relevant for classroom practice, or not learning the curriculum that is the curriculum that predominates in a particular state or district, just as an example. These are highly variable, so in some places they're terrific, bolted together very nicely and focused in ways that produce results, and in other places very ineffective. Across the board, I think it's fair to say that ineffective approaches tend to predominate. Just as an example, around the area of teacher knowledge, of child development, which you would think would be a very important aspect of a workforce development system, particularly in higher education. If you survey higher education or survey teachers being trained in higher education, you see a stunning amount of variation in terms of what teachers to be are exposed to, and in many cases you see a good amount of inaccurate information about things like literacy development, for example, or self-regulation. It's pretty fair to say that we now believe, this is the second bullet, we now believe that it's really important to invest in people and invest in the workforce. I think that case has been made. I'm not necessarily talking about compensation, I'm talking about the investments we make in improvement. And a lot of money, a lot of funds have moved into improvement. And I think it's kind of fair to say that we haven't seen much uptick in terms of improvements around quality metrics of any sort, and any cascade into student outcomes. I think we're in a phase in which, if we want to continue to make that argument as a field for more investment, this is something we see all the time, we need more professional development. I think we've got to begin to demonstrate that the current investments are beginning to return at least something. So consequently, we have this kind of characterization of kind of a haphazard approach to the design of these systems and also their implementation. Those are two different things, designing something and then going out and implementing it. Both of those are fairly haphazard. I think the focus on quality rating and improvement system frameworks have been really, really helpful in getting people to think about the idea that to kind of approach workforce development as a system that should have identifiable components, should have tools that reflect those components or their actions as they cascade into practice or teacher behavior and knowledge, and that those parts should somehow be aligned. But I think this idea of what the components ought to be, what are the tools, how are things aligned, really do vary considerably. And yet, despite all that variation, a lot of promising approaches that I'll show later. Next slide, please. So, as we've looked at the work that has gone on out in the field more generally, and in the places that seem to be most effective, I think Jason's presentation will kind of show this to be true. And in the work that we've done, it's like these 4 principles that we really look at in terms of a workforce development system. I want to keep emphasizing this idea of system. These are multiple parts that are oftentimes moving and dynamic, and we've got to bring them together. So first is this point about clarity. So we've got to build and design systems and articulate what those components are and what the processes to connect those components are at a level of precision that really is not quite present. So if I were to say, what do we mean by curriculum? We might all say that it's great for programs to have a curriculum. It ought to be part of a quality rating or a workforce development system. And yet we might not agree on what that actually means as one might observe it in a classroom or choose it as a procurement agent, and then have a very difficult time in terms of then being able to talk about what does it mean when that is implemented well, and then what are the supports that are needed to implement that. So I think this level of precision and clarity around stating the components and how they connect to other components and understand their role and function is really, really important. Second point is really around focus. And we've done some work on this many years ago when quality rating systems were first rolling out across the country. And you saw some very complicated systems. So for example, you'd find systems that had 9 different components that were markers of quality that a program had to be focusing on, or a teacher or a program leader had to be worried about. And our hypothesis at that time, it still remains, I think a working hypothesis that's gotten some confirmation, is that the more of those components that you have, the more diffusion of attention, diffusion of resources that one can deploy against improvement. And consequently, you end up with real scattered efforts and often ineffective efforts. Our focus, and I think borne out really by the 2 presentations we heard both from Linda and Dale, is really focusing around teachers, the educators, the actual implementers, of early education, the more proximal resources to kids learning. Their knowledge, their practices, and how they implement tools and curriculum is really a critical component. And if you were to make decisions about reducing the components in a QRIS or a workforce development system, you'd want it to align around and focus around those teacher components. Simplicity, similarly, keep the number of components and processes few. This kind of goes hand in hand with focus, but I think it's somewhat different. So one can imagine having a very focused system, but having it filled with lots of components and additional moving parts that are designed to change that or improve that focus, when in fact, again, in a system with limited resources, limited attention, keeping the number of moving parts fewer tends to be better. And then finally, this issue around alignment. How is it that we make the components and the processes kind of bolt together? So it may not be enough to say, in a state policy or in a district, we're going to work on literacy this year, and we're going to choose a literacy. We're going to allow the literacy program to be the choice of schools or programs, and then you may choose your professional development to help move or improve your literacy implementation, and end up with a highly varied set of arrangements within any given classroom or within any given program that are not connected in ways that are likely to make the improvement one desires. PD tends to be a very generic thing that is not often procured or chosen on the basis of a specific target or goal or outcome. Focus, as I'm talking about here. Okay, next slide. What I want to be able to do is talk a little bit about what Louisiana has done. This is draws from work that my colleague Daphne Basak has done at UVA. Basically, it's about 5 or 6 years ago, in Louisiana's design of their quality rating and improvement system, and this was going to be applied across any Birth to 5 program accepting state funds. They chose a very sort of almost a radically focused and simple system, which was really to describe quality in terms of teacher-student interaction and define it more specifically using the class as its way of kind of operationalizing that. Although one could imagine, the kind of ideas that Dale just presented being, the operationalization of that broader game or that broader goal. And then the other piece of the system is professional development that is targeted and aligned to and uses the class as kind of its basis of a kind of language and lens for teacher-student interaction. So you could see this kind of simplicity, focus, and alignment kind of built in. What's also interesting is also the incentives for teachers to choose professional development and that is based upon class were also built into this mechanism through a tax credit program that incented teachers to choose a particular professional development program that had been vetted as aligned to interactions. So in the sense, you had a very simple kind of structure that was being implemented through a single measure applied across all contexts and embedded in the local context through the use of local observers that actually were able to bring that operationalization of interaction into the local context. So let's kind of see what happened over the course of a few years. Next slide, please.
So
this is basically.
1 minute warning.
Pardon?
Your 1 minute warning.
I got a 1 minute warning. I'm on it. Okay. So this slide is basically as you work across the top and toward the lower right, you see as the counties get darker, their class scores are basically going up. So over the course of a 4-year period, you see basically the quality of teacher-student interaction in the state improving. Next slide. And that this improvement occurred whether across those 4 years it occurred whether it was in childcare, Head Start, or school. So you see this improvement as a general trend across all type of programs in their auspices. Next slide. So what we've learned, I think, is that indeed we have case studies. This is one of them, that workforce systems can indeed improve the quality of teaching. We're now evaluating whether that's cascading into learning. Some of the important points: align components that shape the behavior of teachers and leaders. Make sure all these components, higher ed, the incentive systems, the standards, all these moving parts are identified for the specific way in which they shape the behavior of teachers and they shape the behavior of leaders, and bring a level of precision to those descriptions that are currently not the case. Focus on relevant skills and knowledge. Again, this is like stop boiling the ocean, stop putting everything into our workforce development system. Let's focus on the things most relevant for kids learning. Implement these professional development models in an ongoing basis over extended periods. So you saw from the Louisiana example, 4 years led to growth. So this is really about how we implement over time. And the next bullet, how we use data to target and improve PD in a kind of continuous quality improvement, growth-oriented position to workforce development. Then it's really a matter of how we link the activities and choices that people will make and their participation into a set of incentives, whether it's credentialing and by competencies rather than necessarily just degrees, how we create systems that have registries and portfolio, how we tie pay to these elements of a workforce development system, then become a way of kind of binding these ingredients into a robust system. And finally, I'll just put this point about certification of professional development providers. We certify teachers, we certify leaders. We do very little to certify professional development providers in terms of providing procurement agencies data on the skills and knowledge that professional development or that provider improves. Thanks.
Thank you, Bob. Our next presenter is Dr. Jason Sachs from the Boston Public Schools.
Mute myself there. All right, I should be unmuted and seen. Hopefully I am. All right, so my presentation is sort of divided more on the research side. The first part of the chapter that I wrote was more about how Boston Public School and myself as a manager work with our team to give you a sense of sort of how do you run a strong early childhood program situated in a public school system. And then how we use research to sort of inform the choices we've made. This presentation is going to focus more on the research side, but if you're interested in sort of the guts, go to the next slide, please. I'm just going to lay that out. Okay, so in this, basically, this is sort of our theory of change. And the idea is it moves from curriculum and instruction all the way to building capacity within the district, leveraging partnerships, and doing research and evaluation and sharing our work. And so it's sort of color-coded to match from classroom out, and it's sort of the systematic approach. And if we do all of these things together in a strategic way, then good things happen for kids. And again, we are really talking, we changed our mission statement a little bit because we've been doing some culturally sustaining practice, but this is the old one. But the idea is that we are very clear that we want children able to read, write, and communicate effectively by 3rd grade. So we do have an academic focus, and that we really are, we're not staring at the opportunity gap, but we are definitely using that as one of our metrics. Okay, next slide. Good. Okay, and so then what we do is we broke it down into curriculum, professional development, district collaboration, supporting families, and partnerships. And then each of these categories or sets in our strategic plan then go to the next slide, to activities that we use our theory of change and models to really guide the work we're going to do. So and this is one example of professional development. And then so these are our strategies. So again, we align it to the teacher evaluation system and the district goals. We develop instructional leadership, meaning how to help administrators, principals, help teachers have a common definition of what quality is and what they should be looking for. Then the coaching, which is, we don't really separate out coaching from curriculum, from professional development. It's actually our coaches do the professional development, and the coaches are the ones who also write the curriculum. And for us, the curriculum really is the tool that has the high impact instructional moves that we want to see teachers making, that really drives a lot of the quality. Then the accountability has to do with, so who is the coach reporting to? What's the relationship between the coach and the principal, the coach and ourselves, and our accountability to teachers? And then we evaluate the effectiveness of that program. So that's just an example. And then these activities turn into work plans with budgets, people responsible, and sort of like the whole arc of accountability and transparency about what we're working on and what we're not working on. I tried to sort of lay out the process for that in the chapter. Okay, next slide. Okay, so now I want to sort of switch. So I've had the pleasure of partnering with Chris Weiland and other researchers over the last 14 years. And I didn't come into early education as someone who wanted to be a teacher. I really came into it as a researcher, someone who said, oh my God, early childhood does make a difference and really does seem like maybe not a magic bullet, and bullet's probably the wrong word these days, but an opportunity to really leverage change. And so using sort of research is a natural muscle for me, and using data to guide our work. So in the last 14 years as the Boston Public Schools, we've used data informally, and that means coach to classroom. The classrooms give information to the coaches. We have 3-hour-long staff meetings every 3 weeks. And so like constantly we have this feedback loop of what is going on in the classroom, how does that inform the curriculum, how does it inform the instruction, how does it inform our PD, how does it inform our priorities. And like more than 70% of my staff are actually coaches in the classroom. And so that feedback loop is really important. And then we also use NAEYC accreditation and the process and the systematic monitoring that allows us to, and an outside agency as a quality marker, probably very similar to the way states would use QRIS, but we use NAEYC accreditation. So that's sort of the informal way that we use data. Then we use a lot of administrative data. So we're obviously looking at race, culture, language, low income, free and reduced lunch, whether or not children attended a certain program, whether they've stayed in a school. So we've used a lot of district kind of demographic data. And then we've also used district measures, such as there was DIBELS, now we're on to MAP, which is a strong literacy measure. We also used a kindergarten report card, which we've now rewritten, that covers domains. So it looks a lot like work sampling, but it has 7 different domains that teachers use to look at children. And we're now going to walk those domains against MCAS scores and longitudinal data, which I'll get to soon. So this is, again, that constant interaction between what you want to apply to inform instruction with also what really is measuring strong outcomes for students. We've also done descriptive and inferential studies, like looking at the impact of K-1 on, how do kids who go through our pre-K program do on state scores, whether or not programs that are NAYC, do they do better accredited, are they better on the class, are they better in student outcomes? So we sort of look at like big interventions and whether or not they make a difference. And then also looking at like what's the difference between the Boston Public School quality and the community-based programs. I know Dale is talking about differences between public schools and community-based programs. And so making change in both those spaces is really important. And we're actually in 37 classrooms serving 540 students in community-based programs. And then we try and look at quality measures, and then we often will randomly select like 4 to 6 kids and look at student outcome measures. And we did that as we were starting up probably the first 8 years. Then we started moving into longitudinal evaluations. We're part of a longitudinal evaluation that's looking at pre-K through 3rd grade, though 2nd grade COVID hit, so now we're not quite sure what we're doing there. We have participated with Chris Weiland on a BOOST study, a regression discontinuity design that really showed us some important impacts of our programs. And then now we're also, because we're in community-based programs and implementing at a much larger scale, we're beginning to look at implementation of the UPK program, and then specifically targeting math professional development and community-based programs, because we didn't do such a great job the first time around, and we know that math is really important, both for mathematical skills, but it also seems to be connected with vocabulary skills. So the whole point of showing you all of these is just to tell you that like we use data all the time, and we use it from informal to formal, and it's all really helpful. But there's a lot in a research practice partnership that needs to be worked out. And, again, we go into it more in the chapter. Okay, next slide. So what I wanted to do is just share some lessons learned and then some random thoughts. So I'm just going to read them. So specific aspects of instructional quality are predicted of student outcomes more in global measures. So like, we can use the class, we can use other measures, but what we really need is much more fine-grained student to teacher interactions. And so like one of the things that we've done for our curriculum, for example, is rather than using the class, we're actually looking at, was our curriculum operationalized? How do we measure that? And then we have an adherence scale and we have a quality scale. And then from those, we can say, okay, when you do these things in our curriculum, we are seeing, and we've clustered them, we are seeing strong outcomes in students in pre-K and K. We're now looking at 1st grade. And so, for example, they began to cluster around concepts. When you are defining and using vocabulary, the teachers are doing that when they're differentiating, when they're creating extensions, and when they're making connections for students. Those are 4 things. So I know Dale has 8, Bob had more, but these are the 4 we sort of sat in. And again, it was bound in our curriculum. And then by looking specifically at clusters within our curriculum, we were able to do professional development. We're also seeing sort of when the teacher and the child are engaged in what we're calling unconstrained activities, like vocabulary, like big ideas, like making connections, you're seeing more long-term outcomes. When they're doing the more constrained skills, as Dale pointed out, there's only 26 letters. At some point, once you learn it, you've learned it, and there's not much more to gain. Interestingly, though, we found with low-income students, when families were using more unconstrained skills and having more conversations with their kids, you saw those kids doing better in school. So really, I know Linda talked about the importance of families, but really working with families. And I have an interesting example that I was just looking at about sinking and floating. It's a home kit that we've sent home with families for summer school. And the child was basically like, I knew the scissors would sink, but the child kept saying the scissors will drown. And the parent said, well, actually, people drown, or living things drown, not just objects. And so she was able to make the distinction between drown and sinking, and then use vocabulary connections for that child. And that was a family member who did it. I was like, is that a teacher or a family member? It was the parent. So that's just really important, those kind of scaffolds. We've also found out that aligning the pre-K and the K curriculum improves student outcomes. We're now looking at first and second, but so it's really important to start thinking about aligning curriculum pre-K to second, otherwise all this stuff is going to wash out. We also found that in community-based programs that have mixed income kids and in public schools that have mixed income kids, kids do better. So, and we're currently looking at that as well in the older grades. And so I think knowing that we have to create mixed income programming is a really important thing. And I don't want to let that one go, because obviously a lot of our programs are subsidies and a lot of our public schools are segregated. What we found in community-based programs, and I think if you look at Bob's heat maps or some of the community-based programs, you see the same thing. That change is harder in community-based programs, but I want to say that some of our highest quality programs are actually in community-based programs, but that it's harder to maintain turnover, administrative support, alignment between executive directors and directors. A lot of financing is very different. And they have to be treated one at a time. And so in our 37 classrooms, and I think it's like 18 programs, we're really doing a much deeper and sustained experience than when you're implementing a curriculum across a district. So those distinctions have to be understood for the successful implementation. Next slide, please. And I'm almost done, Jacqueline, just in case you're on the edge of your seat. So I have 2 more slides. Okay, let's see. Okay, so quickly, I'm just going to sort of go through what we don't know. So while we know in general early childhood is working, we don't know enough about quality and how it interacts with race, culture, second language learners, and special education. And I think we should stop and pause at that. Like, we are trying to serve specialized populations that have specialized rights and need our best attention, and we keep sort of going to the generic child with the generic measure. I know, Linda, you've led the way for dual language learners, but really understanding like which models work best, I think is something really important. And I think we're gonna have to have some hard conversations. I think of Lisa Delpit's work is really asking some hard questions. And so I think we just have to continue to push in there. I already talked about the specificity of measures. You know, Bob, the class has been great at focusing on it, but I think we just need to get even more specific about exactly what the teacher is doing so that we can operationalize and implement it at scale. I think that we really have to focus on the nesting of income, of families, the expectation that builds in a school culture, the sustainability of schools as it relates to families, income, and sort of our just instructional bias that exists within a lot of these structures. And so we're really going to have to look at that. Chris's Boost study, we defined a quality school almost by looking at MCAS scores, which are our state scores of families, and that made it a high quality score school. So somehow we've got to figure out how to unnest those things or treat it as one big thing. And finally, I think we have to understand like where programs are in their stages of development and structure. So have they been implementing the curriculum for 1 year, 3 years? Has that executive director been there a long time? Has that director been there a long time? Because programs have a ton of variation. And so unless we really understand sort of where a program is, talking about it in a generic way isn't very helpful for people who are trying to implement it. And had we known these things, then we would do our implementation differently depending on where the program was at. Next slide, and I believe this is my last slide. I have sort of some thoughts about student outcomes. One thing I think we really need to do in order to be relevant to school districts is begin to understand what are the predictive measures for 3rd grade testing, 5th grade testing, 12th grade testing, graduation. I think researchers are sort of like, you do the PPPD, you do the Woodcock-Johnson, and then maybe it goes to a Terra Nova or something, but really being more relevant to school districts and those measures. I think the idea of constrained and unconstrained needs more specificity, but I think it's really important that we begin to articulate exactly what skills early childhood is supporting and how that is relevant to academic success and college success. I think we need, I think Bob has started some great stuff here, but I think we need to understand more the impact of coaching, professional development, degrees. Nobody mentioned degrees. I know we talked about certification and classroom placement. How teachers end up in a classroom is often not very intentional. So we often have like our most struggling students with our newest teachers in our most struggling schools. And there's not a lot of thinking that goes into it. And so we really need to be much more intentional. I think we have to address teacher and institutional bias as part of the fabric of our work. I'm unsure if we can untangle the web that has been built. Maybe we have to redesign our systems in an effective, equitable way. Maybe COVID gives us that opportunity, but we really have to address the inequities in the system and the bias that exists. And then I think we really do need to build more systematic connections between the early childhood models, Head Start, and school districts. I think school districts bring a lot to the table. I think they have a lot more resources, and ultimately should be a strong partner in this. I don't think we can sort of sit and say, well, the schools mess it up and therefore they can't be involved because they're really interested in skill building and academics, because I think we're just wasting time. The two systems have to be built together and each have their strengths. All right, I think that's it for me. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. Our speakers have given us a lot to think about, and Dr. Ellen Freedy from the National Institute for Early Education Research is going to share some reflections. Ellen?
Thank you so much. First for having this opportunity to have to read 4 chapters that I wanted to read and that are really very, very informative. And I want to commend them to you. I know we're all just on total information overload right now. Most of us are trying to figure out what the right answer is for reopening schools. Those of you who don't have to worry about that, I don't in a way, except that I'm advising states on how to figure that out. And it's a hard time to spend time on these really important issues for the future, but I do recommend at least these 4 chapters. I haven't had a chance to read the whole book yet because they didn't ask me to discuss the whole book, but I want to read the whole book. That's not to say that I agree with all the author's conclusions, but I'm not going to go into that because I'm going to be really brief because I know that we have Q&A coming up and that discussion among the authors is really important. I am going to draw on my varied experiences in early childhood education that are listed here on the slide. Oh, I'm sorry, next slide, Andrea. I've had a lot of, I'm an old lady, but I've also had a lot of jobs. And I don't know if this shows my age or it just shows that I can't keep a job. But I will be trying to connect some thoughts to the different positions that I've held in early childhood education. And my thoughts are pretty random and do not form the beautiful system that Bob talks about for professional development, nor have the kind of coherence and consistency that Jason's program in Boston has had. But these are my thoughts very, very quickly. I think you all know what KISS stands for, keep it simple, stupid, but not simplistic. And I'm afraid when people are reading some of the chapters, because they are so well reasoned and clear, that it could be thought that they could become implemented in a simplistic way. For example, as a teacher back a million years ago, I would have been so thrilled if my supervisor had 4 essentials for me to focus on, as Dale proposes. That would have made me feel more effective, as Bob and Bridget talk about in my professional development. Instead, I was a demonstration classroom teacher in the High Scope Educational Research Foundation. And I had the preschool teacher training profile that had over 100 strategies that I was supposed to, that I was judged on. And so even though I obviously had to be pretty good at this curriculum, or they wouldn't have put me in the demonstration preschool, I felt demoralized every time I was observed. And by the way, High Scope had a coaching system over 40 years ago that was pretty good. So I think that those, I'm very compelled by those 4. I think everyone agrees that they're critically important, but we can't be simplistic, because when I took over developing the pre-K program for the state of New Jersey, I had to worry about things like, teachers not knowing how to set up a classroom even. And so, or subject-specific pedagogy. They're not that the four essentials that Dale proposes don't tell you how to deal with math, or specifically, for example, those technical and important aspects of dual language learners. So I think we want to be as clear and focused as Bob and Bridget talk about, and at the same time remember that there's a context here and there are other things that we have to be concerned about. And that's related to the focusing on fundamentals. This set of chapters is about what do we still need to know, and I think there's still too many fundamentals we don't know. We don't know how different structural elements interact with each other. For example, I don't think, I would be interested to know if Bob and Bridget think that their system would work in Texas, where there is no class size limit and no assistant teacher in preschool classrooms. So there are literally classrooms with as many as 30 preschool children in them. And I don't know that that's going to get solved with that. So these other issues matter as well, I guess is what I'm trying to say. And I'm not saying Bob and Bridget say they don't. I think that what's clear across all the chapters is that data needs to be used to inform. Jason's Boston Public School System program really embodies this, but I think in every one of the chapters this comes up again and again, and it's always been something really important to me in these different jobs that I've held. And the one thing I didn't see as much of, and I just want to call it out, it's not that the absence of it means it's not important, but that's the role of self-assessment for the learner, for the teacher, for the child, and for the system. Jason really talks about that in terms of his partnership with the research team and internally. At NEAR, we do what we call utilization-focused evaluation. We first ask the people we're working with what the questions are they want answered. And I think that is something that I've always tried to do in any coaching system or any PD system that I put into place, is ensure that there is that element of self-assessment, which I think goes back to points that were made by Linda and Dale about learners need to be engaged and interested in what they're learning. And so I think that self-assessment is really important. The one I'm going to get really excited about in this, and I haven't really mentioned Linda's chapter, but I'm glad, Linda, that you're so positive about where we are, because I'm really, really concerned about where we are. I'm concerned across our yearbook data at NEAR show that very few states even know how many children speak a home language other than English. And not just they don't know, they don't ensure that the programs know. And as I go out and work with different states and work in different programs, this is just not front and center. How we know what to do, and we just aren't making the steps we're not taking the steps that we need to make sure that we're serving dual language learners well. And when I think it, anyway, okay, enough of my rant about that. But then finally, I just think these three words came up to me over and over again as I read the 4 chapters. You want coherence across all the different aspects of the system. You want consistency, but not rigidity in how you implement. But the big one is commitment. I mean, if you read Jason's chapter and learn how he built the program, or you even think about Louisiana, I think Bob made this point, they had to stick with it. And that's why having that GPS, or that data-informed decision-making, is really important. But what I see happening too much in the field is trying something, not implementing it well, and then throwing it out. And I think that just sticking with it is really important. The other thing is there's still a lot I don't think we know enough about, but we got to plant the tree now, because you know that phrase, the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, but we really need to plant the tree now. And I'm going to say that the tree that I want all of us to commit to is serving dual language learners appropriately, because that's going to take a lot of effort and a lot of time, but we've got to do it given our population. And Jacqueline, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you, Ellen. And I'm turning it over to Sarah.
Thank you all. While everyone has been talking, we have had several questions submitted. So I'm going to start with the first question, which has been designated to Linda, but I feel that other panelists can also comment on it. So the question is, can you talk more about the intersection between language and culture for early education and the implications for practice?
Sure, and that's a great question. So from the earliest days of a child's life, they are learning about how their family conducts business, what values their family has, who's important, who you speak to when, et cetera, what the important family practices are and traditions, and you do this through language. So language is the medium through which we communicate some of the most important aspects of growing up within a cultural context. And so when that language is somehow disrupted or interfered with, then those connections to that culture, that primary culture that gives the children a sense of identity, a sense of security, a sense of connectedness, that can be disrupted as well. And a lot of people tell me, well, that sounds like a good reason to keep a child only in their home language for as long as possible. And in reality, children and adults and all of us can learn multiple cultures. So we learn the culture at home, we can learn the culture at school, and we do it through the types of interactions and the types of strategies that we've been talking about today. But so there's this interrelatedness that we want to understand and respect and preserve, you know, between that family culture and the language through which it's transmitted.
Great. Would any other panelists like to continue? Okay, if not, I have another question. And this question is directed to Dale, but also other people can address it as well. So Dale, the question is, when you were talking about the behaviors that you want, the behavioral counts and the practices, do you recommend rotating activities through the school year? And what about activities or strategies that help peruse a child's interests?
I absolutely recommend rotation. You know, the part of what I was saying, I'm so glad they picked up on it, someone picked up on it, is how seriously you need to take the learning environment of the classroom. The learning environment is not just the teacher talking, it's all the materials you have in that classroom and how well designed they are and how engaging they are. And one of the things that I've been working a lot on is trying to get more activities into the classroom. I call it a stealth math approach. So when I've observed a lot of math centers over the last couple of years, and very little math goes on in the math centers. It's a lot of playing happy families with the counting bears. But there are activities that you can put into those that will actually engage children first more actively and also more in math. So I think we really need to become more conscious and planful and intentional about the kinds of learning materials we put in the classrooms, and that includes rotating them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next question is for Bob. What elements of coaching lead to changing teacher practice?
I think what we've seen be the most effective elements of coaching first is to have a model. You know, like not all coaching is coach. A lot of people talk about coaching, but they don't have a specific model for how they have articulated the way that the coach's behavior and the experiences of the teacher are going to lead directly to improved practice. So again, this is another place for alignment and therefore to be a real through line between what the coach is doing, what the teacher's expected to experience, and what ends up. For us, in what we've seen, I think this bears out in a lot of other examples of coaching models, is teachers need to see their behavior. They need examples of that. They need examples of that in snippets, not have to find the good stuff in a 45-minute video, but to be presented with examples of what they do well, tied to again a model of effective practice, and then they need to see examples of occasions in which they don't do that well, and have the ability through repeated practice and repeated visualization to internalize essentially kind of a gyroscope for effective practice or a compass for effective practice, and have opportunities to see themselves enact that in the classroom. But to us, it's examples and it's structure and it's seeing things in a very visualized fashion.
Can I just jump in for just a second? I so agree with Bob. We've been doing a lot of work with coaches over the last couple of years, and that's probably one of the least defined professions. When some of the coaches that we worked with portray themselves as being on a journey with the teacher, basically meaning our role is just to support the teacher, whatever direction she's going in. So without the kind of structure and plan that you're talking about, Bob.
Can I add, Sarah? I just wanted to say, Bob, that I don't know if you're aware that the coaches in the system here in New Jersey do get a kind of certification that the state, it's not an official, but in order to be a master teacher, which is the name for the coach, they have to go through that. May I add a question, Sarah?
We have very limited time, Ellen,
Okay.
so do you mind if I would prioritize the folks that submitted a question?
Sure, of course.
Okay, so here's another question, and I'm going to ask Jason to address it first, but it was for all the panelists. This question is about the role of paraprofessionals and assistant teachers in classroom instructional quality, and if the panelists could talk a little bit about how they see those professionals playing a role for quality, and explicitly how systems can more recognize all the different roles for the adults in a classroom. So Jason, can you talk about that first?
Sure. So paras and assistant teachers are completely underused, and it's unfortunate. I think we really try and build relationships between the teachers and the paras so that there's clear communication, that the paras, we scaffold centers so that where the adult should be, which kids can do independently. Often paras are much more reflective of the students that we're serving, and so there's a great sort of opportunity there. They have opportunity funds, they know the families, they reach out more. So I think we really are trying to think more like leverage para opportunities and assistant teacher opportunities. And as we think about professional development growth models, I think it's important to think about how do we get them degrees, how do we enhance their knowledge, how do we give them the supports to have them move through the system. But specifically, we have a para, we invite, whenever we do professional development, like we do a kindergarten conference, we have paras come to that. We also have specific paraprofessional trainings that we do. And in Boston, we now just moved from a half-time paraprofessional in K2 classrooms to full-time paraprofessionals. I was actually negotiated in our contract. So I think, the importance of paras is critical, and it's a huge opportunity for us to develop more workforce.
I would just offer that paras spend a lot of time with kids. And so they are absolutely part of the quality calculus, and I think oftentimes are marginalized. They're oftentimes not provided information on what quality is intended to look like in that classroom, or as Jason just described, provided supports to enact that. So I think they're a vastly underutilized resource.
I would add to that oftentimes the paraprofessionals or the teacher assistants are the language models for children's homework. And so developing that capacity to present good language models, both not just conversationally, but also academically in terms of reading stories, providing input prior to academic lessons, et cetera. All of that is really important. So they are, I mean, in a dual language classroom, frequently it's a monolingual English-speaking teacher and a paraprofessional who may speak one or two other languages. So they are really important to supporting the type of program design that I've been talking about. And in our programs, they are in every professional development. You really, literally, almost can't tell the difference sometimes because they take a really strong role in language development for DLLs and a strong connection to the families and to the families' cultures.
But we often don't treat them that way. Sorry, Jason, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, I think you need to build it into your structure. I think it's one thing to sort of pay lip service to the importance of paras, but I think like building it into the curriculum, building it into pay structure. So like in our UPK program, you're able to increase the salary of paraprofessionals or assistant teachers. So I think we have to be much more intentional about building pathway programs, about making sure that they have access to technology if we're sending things home to families now and they're doing virtual environments. So I guess I appreciate the question, but also we have to own the fact that we got to be much more intentional about it.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question, and this would be addressed to all the panelists. And so the question is, looking at the features of high quality programs in early care and education settings and providing some advice to parents of children of color, how would you provide some support for concerns that such parents have about kids being classified as being behind in academic skills? So how can we support parents in this transition from early care and education settings to a more didactic elementary school learning environment while they're experiencing a discontinuity of the teaching and learning experience they had between early care and education and kindergarten and first grade?
Well, there are several questions there. But for one thing, I really would like to change the didactic nature of the K-1 situation. And I certainly do not want to make pre-K like that so that the kids are prepared now at 4 to engage in that sort of didactic, rigid instruction. So just because they're going to have to do in K and 1. So that would not be my idea of coherence.
I would also say that I think as early childhood educators, we have an obligation to help parents understand what's really important about the educative process. And I know for dual language learners, certainly we play a role in helping them understand the value and the importance of the language in the home and how that contributes to their academic achievement in English, which oftentimes overrides some of their instinctive natures around their own home practices. So I think I know when I was running programs, I mean, I would have families that would say, I want my child to go to Stanford, so you better be teaching him, all of these sophisticated math concepts or whatnot. And I felt like my job was to help them understand the underlying cognitive processes that learn to long-term, not just academic learning, but intellectual curiosity and the kinds of qualities that are going to contribute to not just sounding out words, but really understanding complex concepts and putting ideas together and creating things. And so when you start getting it off of the basic, recognizing the alphabet, et cetera, I think parents tune in a lot more to what they're hearing from their children, what they're seeing from their children in their play experiences, the things that kids say and whatnot, to understand how that illustrates that child's inherent need and desire to learn really important and sometimes pretty complex concepts from the very earliest ages.
I think Linda's absolutely right on this, and would add, I think, the importance that given the role that early childhood educators play in a family's life, they're often, viewed by parents as really support elements in the larger education system. They're real anchors to parents as they move into the K-1 world, helping parents understand the kind of anchors and values that Linda just described, and then also understand this may not be the case, for your child when you go to first grade and see, what you'll see in first grade. And so let me help you understand the different flavors of education that you're going to see, and help the parent build some resilience, in a sense around the expectations that that may be presented to them, and not be worried or driven by the anxiety that, oh, my kid isn't getting X, Y, or Z.
I guess I would just like to point out that public schools are exactly that. They're for the public. And so you guys should fix the public schools as well. And I think having early childhood folks engaged with the public schools allows for those really important conversations. And I think many people in the public schools would agree that while yes, we have to teach the skills to reading, that is not the most important thing for kids, that this deeper cognitive demand is necessary, especially as you move towards college preparation. So again, I don't think, I think there's a lot of pressure put on first grade teachers to think, I've got to teach the skills to read. And that jump from pre-K to kindergarten, but kindergarten to first is like a huge gap in expectation or a canyon of expectations. And so I think we have to do a lot of work in the public school system to show that they'll get there, but it really is the deep cognitive work that's critical, and that the skill building actually is easier to do.
Well, thank you, everyone. I think that we are now ending our webinar for today. So we would like to thank all of our presenters for sharing their time and expertise with us. We'd also like to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. Please join us again for our upcoming webinars, one on August 18th on implementation research in early care and education, and another on September 2nd on moving towards equity in early care and education. We also would like you to visit our website for more detailed information on these webinars, and we hope you will join us to continue the discussion. So thank you all for today, and this is the end of the webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you.